Very good evening and Jai Bhim to everyone. Today is the day 3 of SARA Data Science Summer School. And uh, now we are going to have a session about the research designed by Professor Samantha MacBride. And Professor Samantha is a doctorate in sociology, and she worked with the government in USA with about the issues of discard studies and sanitation in New York. And she used quantitative method as well as qualitative method to understand the issues of sanitation, discard, landfills, and related to the pollution and environment. And today she is with us to share how to understand the complexity of research, how to have a better research design, research methods. And I would like to welcome Professor Dr. Samantha MacBride. And ma'am, floor is open for your session. Please.
Thank you, Dr. AJ. Oh, oh, okay. Thank you. The connection is a problem with everyone hearing.
Yes.
Actually, can everybody hear me?
No, ma'am. Yes, there is
Okay,
a
good.
problem with the internet.
So
Now it's little better. Yeah, we can start, please.
okay, because sometimes I have internet problems here too.
Yes.
So I'm so happy to be back to speak to everyone again. And today I'm going to be speaking about research methods. I want to say this is not going to be a highly technical talk about research methods. You all are in a data science school, and obviously you're learning a great deal about the technical side of research methods, using R, using Python, using statistics. And so I'm not going to really delve deep into that. Instead, what I want to talk about is more um, overview of research. So today I'm going to be speaking about the overview and goal of what I want to talk about. And then we'll spend some time, quite a bit of time, on the importance of the research question, followed by the importance of what's called a causal model, or thinking about causality. And then after that very basic beginning, how you might choose to carry out your research, including research ethics. And I hope we can have another interesting discussion at the end. The other thing I would say before we begin is many of you are in PhD programs, or some of you have PhDs. You also, no doubt, are being required to take classes in research methods in your PhD program. So again, I'm not trying to substitute for that, but more to give you sort of a higher overview of how to think about big questions in research. So what are research methods? Um, they are simply ways of asking questions that follow a structure and a process rather than being reform or free form. And they represent research methods can be thought of as tools in a toolbox, and you want to use the right tool for the job. You also, by using and following standard research methods that most people have agreed are correct, you give yourself legitimacy, and you present yourself as an expert. And that is very important for whatever you want to achieve out of your research. And using research methods can also prevent us from making mistakes of intuition or guessing or things like that. The beauty of them is that they have what I like to call built-in guardrails to keep the researcher focused on actually answering the question and not sort of going off into directions that are not substantiated by data. And the ultimate goal, I think, of applying research methods to a research project and even getting a PhD, which is part of all of this, or not getting a PhD, but doing research um, for any reason, is so that you can present yourself as an expert, right? You have expertise, you're an authority on the subject, and what you have to back that up is the research that you have done that it follows good research methods. So the most important thing about research methods is the question, the research question that you start with. And the research question that you start with is going to be different, obviously, according to your discipline. If you're an economist, you're going to be looking at questions of value, of economic issues at the macro and micro scale. If you're a sociologist like me, you're going to be looking at a broad range of issues having to do generally with this, what we understand as society. Or let's say that you're working for a local NGO and you want to do a research project to demonstrate a problem in your area, or the value of approach of a program or an approach to a problem, right? These all begin with research questions. And the way to think about research questions is through the idea of causation. Why is something the way it is a question of what is causing it, right? And for applied research, which is trying to do something about problems, if we understand the causes, will this help us respond to issues and problems? Another thing to think about when you're starting to formulate research questions, and I have some examples on the right that are taken from my field, but obviously they're going to vary with what your research question is. Are two things correlated? If you've taken statistics classes, you're going to know what that is. If you haven't, all it means is, do they vary together in some way? So they have some kind of a relationship. And if there is a relationship, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense immediately, looking into that relationship will give insight into dynamics of what is going on that others may never have studied or understood. Another question to begin with is more practical and more applied if you're doing applied research. And I'll talk about the difference between basic and applied research later. But very generally, applied research is focused on actually taking research results and doing something with them in the world to improve it, rather than just advancing knowledge. So in applied research, which in my field, which I teach now at a school of public administration, it's almost all applied research because it's very much focused on preparing people for careers in the NGO sector and the government sector. So another question is, how should we go about carrying out a policy or a program or addressing an issue, right? And very important, especially in the NGO world where organizations are applying for grants and things like that, is how will we know whether what we're doing works? If we have, let's say, a literacy program, how are we going to know at the end of a year or 2 months whether the efforts to improve literacy in an area have actually done so? And another important question, and this gets to research ethics that we'll talk about later, is who is we, right? So I use the word we all the time, and everybody does, sort of generally to talk about a sort of a vague sense of society as a whole. But of course, we know that we is not a universal global we where everybody is facing the same situations and comes from the same backgrounds at all, right? So to always be careful about thinking about who is we? Is we the government? Is we a certain sector of society? Is we the academic community? It's always important to keep that in the back of your mind as well. Um, Another area, and this is what I do a lot of research on because I'm interested in the role of ideas and ideology and how that affects public policy. Is this just a common belief? Or is the common belief backed up by evidence, or is it just what everybody thinks is going on, but there's really been no evidence to support that, or at least for a long time? Um, so this is something that, depending on your research question, you may want to address. I this is a lot. I do a lot of research in this area, and I use mixed methods for that, which I will discuss in a second. So that's another kind of question. And then also, is it always this way, both in terms of time and in terms of place and in terms of culture, right? So this is like talking about we. Um, if there is some feature of society or human behavior that is being measured and researched, what was it like in history? What was it like in other areas of the world, other nations, or even other districts or other cities? This is the historical and comparative method, and I also use that a great deal. This is often what qualitative research is looking at, which I'll get to in a minute. And this question is also related to the idea of, if you may have heard this phrase, another world is possible. So many social activists and researchers want to say the world doesn't have to be this way in terms of suffering, in terms of inequality, in terms of violence or war or the many tragic things in our world, right? It does not need to be this way. And we can look at history or we can look at other places as evidence of that, to show that this is not just the natural state of society, which is an old view that sociology sometimes was guilty of. So when you're thinking about research methods, they consist of parts that have to do with planning, actually carrying out the research, the analysis, which is where data science is really going to come in, is very powerful, as well as ethics. And although it may seem like a step by step, first you do this, then you do that, then you do a third thing, um, it doesn't, when you do research, it doesn't always unfold that neatly. There's going to be a lot of going back to the drawing board, collecting some data, and then realizing it's the wrong thing that you want. Right now, I'm working with some students on a project on an island that is off the coast of Manhattan, to do a survey to understand. On that island, there's food that is served. It's a sort of a tourist destination. And we are trying to move away from single-use plastic containers to a reuse system on the island where we would have durable containers. that would be washed and reused between each use. And so the students right now, we've designed a survey and they're going out, actually later this week, they're going to do a test survey. And then we're going to come back, having collected a little bit of data and see if we need to adjust the questions. So that's kind of a small example of the back and forth that goes on. But it's generally these steps that are going to go from start to finish. Um, and you're going to be keeping your eye on all of them throughout the research process. So, causality, in my view, this is one of the most important um, features of research design. And so I'm going to take some time on it. By causality, and sometimes my students say casual rather than causal, right? Casual meaning informal. No, what I mean here is causal. What causes something? And just like we talked about yesterday, there's certain things that the human brain, and it doesn't matter where you live or who you are, it's a human feature. We're always looking for causes. If we're interested in B, we want to know what causes it. And we write that A causes B, or A arrow B is how it's written in the conventions of causal maps, which is what I'm showing you here. Now, in reality, many things can cause B. And sometimes there can be intervening variables as well. So something might not directly cause B, but it's going to cause E, which will cause B, right? That's what this general diagram shows. And of course, social complexity is in reality is so complex that we never can fully list out all of the causal factors. So we want to be looking at the major causal factors. And for those of you who have studied statistics, um, the amount of error that is allowed in statistical calculations is going to capture those other variables that may not be very large, but are there, as well as randomness. Sometimes things are causing B, but B may also have some randomness to its to how um, it's playing out, let's say. So on the right, I have like a very elementary causal map of what I consider to be a sort of what most people think about what causes the individual recycling rate, um, especially in the area of individual knowledge and individual motivation. I have found, at least in the United States, where I've done my research, that there's this great belief that really what is important about recycling is to inspire individual people to do it. And that is, of course, important. But my research has actually found that infrastructure, meaning eh, not only the buildings, but also the collection vehicles and the labor, especially, is as important or more important. And that without those things, no matter how much a person wants to recycle, they're not going to be able to recycle because the conditions aren't there. There's no bin in their building, or there's no truck coming by their house to pick it up, or there's nowhere for them to take it. And so they can be as motivated and knowledgeable as you want, but if they don't have the physical capacity to do it, it's not going to happen. And so the some of the research I'm doing now, whoops, I'm sorry, is to point that out and say to the city of New York, stop investing money in trying to inspire people and go out and work with the building superintendents and the porters and the custodians to make sure that we have our buildings set up properly for recycling. And in causal models, we can also have variables that stand in for another factor that we haven't thought of, especially if, as we go on, we find that these causes are not fully explaining what we're studying. It's also possible that we might get to the end of a research project and we still haven't figured out what that other factor is. And that's fine. You would say in the conclusion of your research that we believe that A, C, and D working through E are strongly important for the B outcome, but that there are other factors that need more research. Now, I wanted to share sort of a personal anecdote that gets to the rules of causality and how innate it is for human beings to think about causality. So the rules of causality are that A has to precede B in time. If we're talking about A causing B, it has to happen before B or simultaneous with B, maybe, rarely. That A and B vary together. So it's not just that A is randomly happening and B is randomly happening, and every now and then they coincide. And finally, that A is not kind of a stand-in. The cause is not a stand-in for something that is really happening, right? So in this anecdote, I have a picture of a manual scale here, and in this picture, it's weighing some meat. But when I was in university, undergraduate, back in the 1980s, I was working as a lab assistant, and we used these kinds of manual scales back then to weigh things that we needed to weigh for the lab experiments. So I was alone in the lab, and I was setting up the scale, and I touched it. I touched the top of the scale, and a buzzer rang on the wall. And I didn't think anything of it. I thought it was random. And then I'm moving around the scale and I touched the top of, by touching, I pressed it down a little bit and the buzzer rang again. And then I started to think, this couldn't be. This scale is not connected to anything. It's a manual scale. Plus, the buzzer is controlled by the hospital. I was working in a hospital. It must have been a coincidence, right? And so I'm working around again and I hit the top and the buzzer goes off again. Now, by this point, I started to think that maybe there was some connection between me hitting the scale and the buzzer going off. Only 3 times in a row. And I was already thinking that. Half of me was thinking, this isn't possible. And another half was saying, it's not possible that this could have happened 3 times, seemingly in response to my touching this scale, and it not mean something. So I touched the scale again and nothing happened. It was a coincidence, right? It just happened to be a coincidence. And then the bell rang a little bit later. But 1 time I thought nothing of it. 2 times I thought it was weird, but it was a coincidence. But 3 times, and I was already starting to doubt that there was no causal relation. And that story obviously always stuck with me because it was so unusual. I mean, what are the chances that I happened to touch the scale at those 3 times when the bell was ringing? But it did happen, and so it's stuck in my mind as a lifetime memory. Now, I want to also raise the observation that A precedes B in time. I remember learning this when I was studying research methods, and I thought, oh, of course, that makes total sense. How could it be any different, right? This is the real world that we know. Something that causes another thing has to happen before it, or maybe simultaneously, but never after. Never. That would make no sense. So this is a digression because this is not something that we would ever, or right now, be able to incorporate into most research. But as amazing as it sounds, there is research starting to come out in physics that is questioning that. That is saying that actually there may exist something called retrocausality, in which, at least the way that we understand it, something that happened after can cause something that came before. I know it sounds completely, completely, outlandish, but I just wanted to mention that, and then go back to the real world that we all live in, where A precedes B in causality. Is just an interesting area that is emerging in research. So when you're thinking about your research question, spend a lot of time thinking about causality. And you obviously want to look at past research, right? That is part of the literature review part of doing research. Um, you want to look at also, it's rare that you have a simple A causes B situation. You're going to more likely have the multiple variables, and the way that they interact is going to be portrayed in statistical models or other kinds of models that may have been done in prior research. Another thing to look for in doing your literature review is maybe there's another phenomenon that doesn't seem very similar, but has a similar causal mechanism. So, for example, if I'm looking at recycling, and there is a great deal of research on individual motivation to recycle and concern for uh, the earth and things like that. Another area that is potentially comparable is the decision to donate blood, because this is another thing that is a voluntary act, it's an individual act, it is done for the overall good of society. It has to do with the transfer of a material. It has to do with an individual sending materials to an institution. And so there may, if I were interested in motivation, I might look at the research on blood donation, for example, for ideas. Another another area to think about causality in is your hunches. You may have a sense that there's a causal mechanism, or A is causing B, and that's perfectly fine to begin with. That is going to be a bias that you're coming in with, or an untested assumption, but it's fine. It's as good as any other kind of idea that you may want to test. And furthermore, and this is somewhat controversial, but I would be glad to discuss it more. You may have an ideological orientation. You may want to show something because you believe that this issue is so important that it needs the data for you to make your point, right? And the idea that scientists are completely dispassionate and they are only looking at truth, and that they are impartial, is an idea that it certainly doesn't apply to social research at all. but it doesn't even really apply to things like elementary physics. And there's more and more research that's coming out to show that. So every type of research has some kind of political or ideological orientation, whether or not it's openly stated and acknowledged. And it's better, I think, to acknowledge it so you're aware of it and that you can guard against it as a source of bias, but it is not an illegitimate way to approach research. This is my opinion. There are many, probably many professors who would disagree with that. So when I was doing the literature review or the background reading for my dissertation, these are some books that I looked at that were about the question of causality. And I was not in my dissertation looking at recycling behavior or what motivates a person to recycle. Instead, I had a hunch that recycling was, it certainly was an economic activity. There is no question about that. But it was not conserving resources or energy or reducing pollution in the way that most average people who participate in recycling in the United States thought it was. And so I was looking at books that were trying to help me understand some of this phenomenon of what I thought was a widespread belief that was not really backed up by evidence. Some of it had to do with an understanding of the idea of counterfactuals, which means if A had not happened, what would have happened to B, right? And that was relevant to recycling because there was a widespread belief that if we don't recycle, the situation is going to stay the same, but it's going to be we're going to be using more virgin resources than recycled resources. And that is not in most cases true, actually. The fact that recycling exists actually, in many cases, increases the extraction of virgin resources because there's just more overall production and consumption going on. And this idea is still very unpopular, very hard to argue. Um, the next book was written by somebody who was working in the area of water management and water research and was pointing out essentially the same thing. And when I found his book, I emailed him and he was thrilled because he said, no one wants to hear this, you know. So that helped. And then also, I was influenced by this. This is an old book, but this notion of unpolitics or non-decision making, when are issues not addressed, when are issues not even spoken about, that are measurable and obvious and serious. Another thing that I did look at, and I have looked at over the years in more of my applied work is research in social psychology, to understand what guides individual behavior. Um, and this is a causal model that you're looking at. So this is a very, very well-established causal model it was first published in 1977 and has been used hundreds, if not thousands of times over in different research projects. It's called the part in the blue is called the theory of reasoned action, and the whole thing is the theory of planned behavior. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but it is, because it's from social psychology, a lot of it is about what's going on in individual people's heads. And I, as a sociologist, grant that that might be happening, but as I mentioned before, I believe that that part of the story when it comes to recycling is overemphasized for the reasons that I mentioned. So I'm aware of this causal model, and if I were ever working on some very specific questions of how to motivate people to do something, I would use this. But instead, what I did was to kind of construct my own causal model. Um, this is not a perfect causal model. I really put it together for this presentation, but it's the beginning of one, right? And in my understanding of causality, there people need to understand recycling in order to be motivated to do it. They have to understand how to recycle, what they need to do. They also have to understand something about why they should recycle. Um, and that is of course true. And all of that is going to motivate them to recycle. And how do they get that knowledge? Well, they do get it from many, many sources, including what my research was about, including let's say public relations, or some might call it propaganda, some might call it greenwashing, from industries that wanted to deflect criticism, like the plastics industry. They didn't they wanted to be able to say, oh, well, yes, we care about the effect of our product plastics on the environment, and we support recycling. My quantitative research had shown, well, it isn't really protecting the environment, and I'll get to that. Um, and yet people believe it is, right? And they're told this over and over again, often by, if not industrial sources, then governments that are saying what industrial sources have told them. So so my thought was, that's all going on, right? That's sort of the larger context of individual knowledge. But in a city, which is the scale I was operating on, a city with the practical task of asking people to participate in a program and then sending out trucks to collect what people recycle. What is most important is that the institution, meaning the Department of Sanitation, communications, are giving people the knowledge of how they should be recycling, and some reasons that have to do not with saving the earth or things like that, but actually how it benefits um, their own city and their own lives and their neighborhood. And also consistency. A terrible problem in my city is that recycling programs come and go. In some years, people are told to recycle certain things. In other years, they have to recycle other things. And there's a lack of consistency. This is a terrible problem in New York City government. So that was how I understood knowledge and motivation at the individual level. And then, as I mentioned before, what I also strongly felt was that infrastructure and labor, and also what are things made of, and how much are they being marketed, how much packaging, for example, is being used with something like food. Um, these things all set the conditions for individual behavior. And so the model was, I called that individual capacity. Can they do it if they want to do it? And these two factors combine, in my understanding, to drive recycling behavior. So in your PhD programs, um, or other fields of study, you're going to go through these two general areas of method a lot, qualitative and quantitative. very generally, quantitative deals with numbers and qualitative deals with stories and narratives. Quantitative is using statistical methods. Qualitative is using what are called interpretive methods. Quantitative works with big data sets, and qualitative involves interviews and observations. So talking to people, observing people, and also reading. So reading history, reading about situations in other areas of the world, um, all of that, not necessarily reading sociological theory or research, but reading newspapers or blog posts or um, uh, indications of what people have on their mind. That is all qualitative. Um, and there are in the quantitative realm, you can go from using very simple basic statistics, which is what I use, to extremely complex multivariate methods that some scholars really are excited about and get into. I would also say that you bear in mind, you do not need to be one of those scholars who becomes a statistics expert. If you want to, that's great. But often there is more prestige associated with being a statistics expert and using very complicated statistical methods. And so new researchers feel that they have to show that. I certainly felt that too in my life. And that's not true, because as I'll get into, you want to choose the methods that will best answer your question. Um, so there's qualitative research, which I've symbolized with a painter, but of course, this is still social science. This is not humanities. Um, it's not art, but it has aspects that are more of an art, um, because it involves structure, it involves rules, it involves guardrails, it certainly involves formulating a good research question and thinking through a causal model. Those are the social science side of it, right? So it's a science. And quantitative is very much more focused on measuring and measuring numbers. Now, mixed methods are some of the two that are actually dealt with kind of interactively. So you do some qualitative research, and that informs maybe a survey that you want to design to collect data. And you collect that data, and then you realize that from that data, you need to understand another phenomenon, um, and you do that, and then you add that to your quantitative approach, and so on. So mixed methods are not just a blend or a little of both. It's also has this back and forth. And that is, I would say, what I mainly use as a research methodology. So which method should you choose, right? I would say the very first question is there a big data set that already exists about your topic? Or do you have the ability to collect, when I say a lot of data, it would be at the very least 30 observations, but it probably should be a lot bigger. And I'm not going to get into that. That's a side of statistics that has to do with setting a sample size. But in many cases, it's just not going to be feasible. There may not be any data that exists on the topic, and you, as a researcher, may not have the grant funding or the access to go out and collect a lot of data. And in that case, you want to just go straight to a qualitative method because maybe later you can add a quantitative method, but to start, it's just not going to be possible, right? So that's sort of a starting question. And then you want to look at what your research question is. This is going to drive which method to choose more than anything. Does your research question ask something that has an answer that can be measured? If I want to know is there an effect of rates of ticketing on recycling rate in New York City? That's a quantitative question. I can measure that. I can measure the recycling rate. I can look at correlations. I can look at multivariate models and things like that. Or is your research question describing something that is not only more complex, but really can't be broken down into pieces that can be measured? And this is, of course, the reality that we live in. We don't live in a human reality where everything can be broken down and measured. That's using science, right? So scientifically looking at the world as human beings understand and experience it. This is another digression is an area of philosophy that's called phenomenology, which I also use a lot. But these kinds of questions, or questions um, about people's life story or complicated situations, essentially, um, are better addressed through qualitative analysis. Another thing to keep in mind is, are you a positivist? Meaning, do you have the worldview that things can be proven, there are facts that can be measured, something is true or not true. And again, these are mental models that we use in our day-to-day lives all the time. So we all have that aspect. On the other hand, if we really stop and think about it, there aren't a lot of things that we can definitively say without any doubt or any uncertainty that they're true, right? I used to say the law of gravity was one of those things. Well, it turns out no. You know, once you begin to study gravity, especially in this is again physics, especially away from Earth and our Newtonian understanding of gravity, it turns out that gravity doesn't behave the way that we always thought it would. So even that basic premise is not an established fact. On the other hand, we can't go through life saying everything is not, established. Sometimes we have to just have some working definitions of established facts. So the extent to which you are like that, you believe like, let's get the facts down, let's prove it. Um, you would have a positivist orientation. If you're more interested in meaning, in symbolism, in understanding that things are contingent and complex and that they change, and that most of all, an understanding of any phenomenon is a relationship between the phenomenon and the observer. And again, we're getting back to physics here. That is more of an interpretive orientation. And that the positivist orientation goes more with quantitative, the interpretive more with qualitative. But once again, you can apply either one to either methodology depending on the situation. And then finally, I would say, what are you good at? What are you not good at in your own estimation? And also, what kind of research do you like to do? I have taken many, many statistics classes, and I have over the years tried to become more proficient in statistics than I am, and I just have never gotten very far. I know that this is a problem in education overall, what's called math phobia. I know that it's a problem that affects women more than men. nonetheless, right, at my age, I've decided, look, I've tried. I'm not going to get better at this. And I'm not really interested in getting better at this. The basic stats methods I use are good for me. And if I need um, to do something more complicated, I'm going to try and collaborate with another researcher at my university, and there are many of them who is a statistics expert, right? There are a number of economists there who I could collaborate with and talk to. And also, I um, I do not feel comfortable doing ethnography, meaning I don't feel comfortable embedding myself with other people and observing them and writing about them using the qualitative research method of ethnography. And I can get into later why I don't feel comfortable with that. And so I generally don't use that method. I use interviewing, but I mainly look at things that are not going and involving myself in people's lives. And I can talk more about. I just wanted to pause here in case, Dr. AJ, do you want me to pause for questions or just keep going to the end?
Uh, let me check this with the participants. Yes, the participant have a question. So I think, ma'am, you can
Okay,
take a little pause and let the student drop the questions in the chat box, and then,
okay,
yeah, then we'll go next.
okay.
Yes.
Uh, Dr. Samantha, I had two questions.
Yes.
One was when you were talking about um uh, ideological stances for research and that you consider it as illegitimate. Will you be able to describe more? Because we come from a community, and from our perspective, researches have not been done in relation to caste atrocities. A lot of Savarnas have done research on it from a different angle. Now, as coming from a marginalized community, when we want to do research in a certain way based on our ideological stances and our uh, perceptions. Um, obviously, literature is not available on those issues. How would you, what recommendations would you give us? Because as a researcher who is currently working on law enforcement and their caste leanings, this is something that I have been told by several professors who are as in who don't really appreciate caste related conversations. And my second question was, and that is why, because this becomes very emotional, and a lot of people would say that I have a bias in relation to this subject. I thought that I would make it look more objective. Now, to make it look more objective, what I am trying to do is I'm trying to adopt a quantitative method. In that, you were talking about
Mm,
asking questions whose answers can
okay.
be measured. So, will you be able to share a sample of such questions which can give measurable answers? So, yeah, just these two questions. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, definitely. So thank you for those questions. Um, yes, and I say that starting with an ideological perspective, and what I mean by that is point of view about how you think society should be, right? Which everyone has the right to have. Um, I think that is completely legitimate when you're doing research. Um, as long as you use good research methods and you're aware of it and you look at it in yourself and you look at it as, is it biasing my research method? Is it affecting my research method? Um, so this is a view, as I say, that is not held by many people in academia, although it is changing, and is changing rapidly. So in the case of your research, um, I I I don't want to say that I can understand or imagine it, because I have not gone through anything like that myself. However, I am familiar with the need when you're in a PhD program to respond to the professor's expectation of the so-called objectivity, right? And many professors, and it's going to depend on your field, do not want to hear that there is no such thing as objectivity, right? I work with engineers a lot, and I'm actually a fan of engineering. And when I talk to those professors, they look at me like I'm from Mars if I say that. And professors may say, you're not going to get a job, you're not going to get published, and you might also run into a problem with some journals that are saying this is not objective enough. So it's a good idea. I think that it is very wise and strategic of you to put your research question into a framework that does not emphasize the ideology, and that uses the same language of, if not objectivity, of using standard methods to eliminate bias in the results, and kind of, so to speak, playing the game in order to get your PhD. And then when you have your PhD, and ideally when you have a job, you can start to do research that is more along the lines of what you want to do. Before getting into the second question, does that help? Does that answer your question, ma'am?
She says yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Now, as far as choosing research questions that have an answer that can be measured, if we go back to, wait, where were we? Right. If we go back to some of these research questions, right? So really anything can be measured. If I wanted to look at this research question and I wanted to do interviews with people, I wanted to read community newsletters about the recycling program in the community going back to 1980, for example. This is some research I did for my dissertation. That would be qualitative. If I design a survey and I go around and I ask, do you have recycling set up in your building or not? Would you recycle if you had recycling set up in your building? And how much do you know a lot, a little, or nothing? Something like that. That would instantly become quantitative. The question is, do you have the resources to do that survey, right? And that is not always the case. I mean, I have found when I worked for government, we did do massive surveys of randomly selected citizens of New York City. It cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that, and that was done by telephone. I didn't do it. It was done by a professional survey company. There are academics who do large scale surveys, and they have the resources and they have the grant funding, but it's not always something that you can just go out and do. And if you do a survey and you only get a small sample size, or the sample is not representative of the group that you're trying to describe with the survey results, then you're going to have a lot of trouble publishing that. And your professors may depending on who they are, they may not like it, right? So in that case, often what is, if you possibly can, is to try and find an existing data set that is on the topic. And I have done a lot of that because, and this is one of the reasons why I only focus on my own city, New York City, when I do research, is because I know where all of the agency data sets are on the public website, and I know how to use these data sets. So there are lots and lots of data sets that are put up on a public website that have to do with agency operations and things, and complaints of citizens and things like that. And so I use that data. I know that that data has been collected. It's not even survey data. It's just representing agency operations. Ma'am, does that answer your question? Part two?
Yes, Professor. She says yes, and thank you. Yes.
Okay. Are
Okay.
there any other questions right now?
Yes, right now, do you have some more questions?
Okay.
No, Professor, no, not
Oh,
really.
no questions. Okay. Okay. So I will go to where I was. Okay. So also important, and I mentioned this before, is in choice of methods is, what is the aim of your research? It's perfectly legitimate to be interested in something solely for the joy of knowledge, right? That is, I think, one of the, the great things about humanity is that people are trying to understand, they're curious, they want to understand nature. And so that is a form of research. I would call that basic or theoretical. In the area of natural science, that is very, very common because we need to understand basic mechanisms like of how cells function and interact and things like that. Um, and fundamental physics, as I was mentioning before, in order to do other research. In social science, often this is to develop social theories. And that is also legitimate as far as it goes. Um, but if you are doing applied research, which is more in the area of what I do almost entirely, I don't do basic or theoretical research. You also are doing research because you want to solve problems, right? It's not enough to understand society. We need to change it, right? You may have heard that phrase before. And that is, I will confess openly, that is associated with Marx and Marxism, but this is not just a Marxist perspective, right? There are many, many people who agree that the suffering, the violence in the world, as the lady just alluded to, is so bad that it is incumbent upon us as researchers to, at the very least, produce knowledge that can be used to help solve problems and not just for the sake of understanding. And then taking that a step further would be what is called action research or participatory research, where you want to do both of those things, but you also want to involve people who are involved in whatever you're studying in a very deep and engaging way that traditionally was not done in academia. So this is more of a new area. And this is an area that very positivist professors, very quantitative professors may be less interested in or even dubious of. And it is not an easy thing to to argue in your PhD program to do action and or participatory research for your dissertation. Often you will have the professor saying, no, this is not legitimate method. And I'll get into what that would involve in a minute. But it's very relevant for if, let's say, you're working at an NGO and you want to do a research project. I teach a class called Program Evaluation, and it's all about this because my students are working in government or nonprofit organizations. They're not PhD students. They're not getting a PhD. They're getting a master's in public administration, and their orientation is entirely to solve problems, right? That is their driving force. And they're not beholden to professors to legitimize their research because they're working for organizations. So what I do is I do kind of like what I'm doing now, is to share the tools that can be used, help the students formulate the research questions, but they are much more likely to do action and participatory research, which I'll define in a minute and a little bit more. So it's going to depend on your setting and your context. And right now, if you have to, once again, play the game of the university to get your PhD in an applied area, you can then go on to use everything that you've learned in action or participatory research. So this is actually more tending in the direction of research ethics. And research ethics have a kind of, once again, standard aspect to them, and more of a serious and new, somewhat new ethical recognition. So in the standard format, research ethics depend on the idea of informed consent with no coercion. And I know that Dr. AJ has some slides in some of his other lectures about the atrocities of research on people in Nazi concentration camps, and in the United States, research on syphilis that was done on African Americans, in which they were deliberately given syphilis. And there are other atrocities that have been carried out in the name of researching human subjects that in many countries, and I really can only speak to the US, has resulted in some pretty serious federal laws that apply to any research project. And these laws are designed first and foremost for kind of medical experimentation or experimentation on human bodies, but they also do apply to research on any human being that can that emphasizes that they must fully understand that it's up to them whether they want to participate in the research. They can bow out at any time without an explanation. They don't have to answer every question you ask them. And they are in a situation where they are able to give their consent freely. So if they're in a prison, for example, as much as you might say to a prisoner, it's really up to you if you want to participate in this study, they may feel like, if I don't participate in this, there could be some repercussions for me in the prison, or if I do, I might be released, right? Something like that. That is all now prohibited by law in the United States. And if someone absolutely wants to make the case that they need to do research on prisoners, it has to be shown to a big review committee that it's about issues like prisoner health or something like that, that would really be about the prisoners and not just using them as research subjects because they are prisoners. And your university should have rules and guidelines for ethical research that they are requiring you to show that you're following for your PhD thesis. And so that all exists. I'm not really up on the law in India, but I'm talking about the law in the United States, and I would imagine that there are similar laws in India. On the other hand, this is more of a new perspective, is to understand that universities, yes, they have this role in research ethics, and they can do a very good job of it, but they are also, that's not all that universities are. Right? So universities, how did universities first come to be? How did departments first come to be? How did academic disciplines first come to be, right? This is a process that evolved over many centuries out of Europe. And the university that we know today, wherever it is in the world, is following these European models. And these European models, and they're now also, you know, Anglophone world models, are I have a lot of compromising connections with colonialism and other types of exclusion, both in who they admit to the university, who they hire as a professor, and in how they approach research with people. And also universities, and this is completely true in the engineering field, most of the money that is coming for research funding in engineering is coming from industry because they want engineering research to help their industry develop, right? And that isn't maybe as much of a big deal in engineering, but when you have industry funding social research, you have the university turning into a tool for industry, and similarly for governments. So understanding that, and this is why I say you need to kind of play the game of the university. The university has a lot of resources, obviously, a lot of knowledge, and structure and capacity, but the university also is not, it has its own problems that are baked into how the university functions. And so what has become more and more discussed, I would say, and this is Discard Studies talks about this a lot, but that's by no means the only group that does, is that the power that a university and university researchers have, and how it is very, very easy to even unintentionally harm groups of people or individual people that are the subjects of research, even if you're following the formal research guidelines. And how are they harmed? They can be harmed by bringing attention to their way of life that then causes political voices to blame them for the situation that they're in through no fault of their own, or they can be harmed by having their things that are sacred to them taken and shown and put in museums in a highly disrespectful way, or they can be harmed by being basically used, where there's a researcher that comes into their community and changes their community by having that researcher there, and then the researcher leaves and nobody ever hears from them again. The researcher publishes a book and gets tenure. So they get a lot out of it, but the community doesn't. That's another way of being harmed. And also, and this again, this is controversial, and you will find professors that disagree with this everywhere, right? Is that, let's just say there was a research project and it was carried out with proper research methods, and it concluded using sound statistical analysis that men are smarter than women. This was a very highly accepted idea. In academia, up, what would you, should you suppress that research? Should you not do that research? These are some ethical questions that are complicated. I would ask why is the researcher interested in this? And if, for example, such a result were shown, which it would not be empirically true, but if it were shown, the very least that the researcher should do ethically is make sure that this research does not perpetuate practices of violence, of domination, of colonialism, patriarchy, social hierarchies, etc. So to present those results always in context that says this absolutely does not mean that women have fewer rights or women can't make decisions or things like that. And again, this is controversial. So how do you navigate all this? Well, obviously you want to follow all of the rules and laws of your university, and you want to do it not just like, oh, I have to fill this form out and get permission to do my research. You want to really do it with what I say, attention and sincerity. You want to really think about the ethics in a serious way. But that, even if you do that, that's not necessarily going to be enough. And so there are once you've done these formal things, other things to keep in mind is, and this is participatory research, this is action research, is where the research is much more collaborative. You're not studying, this researcher is not studying this group of people like, I'm the scientist, you're the research subjects. This researcher is talking to them about the design of the research project, about the causal analysis, about the research question and the methods. And the researcher is learning from them and is also offering to not compensate them in a transactional, like I'll pay you X for this, although that can be useful, but to give them something back, because when you're researching a group of people, when a researcher does that, they get something out of that, and that is linked to their role as an academic. And it should not be that one-way process. Another way to make sure, some of you probably have heard this phrase, nothing about us without us. I think that's a good way of summing up where groups of people are starting to say, don't come to our community, do a research project, leave, write an article, publish it, get tenure, and then maybe come back 10 years later and give a lecture, right? You need to involve us. If you're studying us, you need to involve us always, right? And with this also comes, and this is something that a colleague of mine really made it very clear, a colleague in discard studies in their book, take no for an answer. Sometimes a researcher will come to a group of people and say, I'd like to do a research project, and they say no, or even they say, well, I'm not sure, maybe later, right? in such a case where they don't say no clearly, don't push them on it. Because they may not feel comfortable saying no, right? And provide something in return. And you need to think carefully about what that something will be once you have met the people. Do they need you to collect additional data on something to help them with a different project? Do they need help with data science, or do they need help at a digging the ditches for the compost site if somebody's researching compost sites like me? All of that, think that through, and show that commitment. Another way to approach ethics, and this is more what I have done, I have to say, although I've done a little bit of participatory research in the composting area, mainly what I have done is what's called studying up, which means you're not going to be studying groups that could be harmed by your research. You're studying either people in very elite positions who, and you're studying them in order to understand their influence on society, or you're studying institutions. That's mainly what I do. You're studying private sector, NGO sector, public sector, organizations of all types. Or don't look directly at people, look at relations among people as your research units. And this is very often done in network analysis and things like that. When you are looking at existing data sets, furthermore, that may have been gathered for fair and legitimate reasons, you're also going to be minimizing the damage that you can do. So the US Census, for example, if you're using census data, the act of using that data is not really going to harm a group of people. How you interpret it may, right? But the actual method is not going to harm anybody. And then finally, this is another thing that I do, is to study what are called artifacts. So rather than looking at people and going and putting them under scrutiny, you're looking at materials, you're looking at infrastructure. Also, how do people talk? What are the patterns in their discourses? And another favorite of mine, thinking about social systems, like what are social systems and subsystems at play here, and how are they structured? And that gets into systems theory. So that's the end of my talk. As I mentioned, this talk does not substitute for coursework and research methods at all. But it is I want to share some orientations that I've learned over the years from my own research experience.
Thank you so much, Professor. And now we can take a few questions if you have. Either the candidate can come to the podium and you can ask the question, or you can drop the question in the chat box. We will wait for a minute and let's see.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Professor, right now there are no questions as such. And if there are, I will try to communicate to you via email, right? And
Okay.
yeah, and this is the third day we are completing of our data science, and the battery is, you know, a little bit getting exhausted of the students because like morning
Understood.
till 7 in the PM, 7 PM. But yes, still we are holding the grounds and 2 more days to go. And we are trying to give them idea of major themes like with your talk, like the research design, research methods. They understood many new things with that, right? So we thank you, Professor Samantha MacBride, for for giving this fantastic lecture and helping us to completing our day 3, right, of the research design. So yes, some participants also sending you thank you for your lecture. And yes,
Okay.
they were asking for your presentations, and so I hope when I received your consent for the presentations, I will share with the participants.
Oh, yes. I actually, I think I responded on LinkedIn that, yeah, it was fine. And I think some of you may have connected with me on LinkedIn. Please feel free to do that. And I wish all of you the best for the rest of this intensive summer program, and a good evening and good rest.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor, and thank you all the participants.
Thank you. Bye-bye.